Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History as we look at the beginning of desegregation in the United States. And in many ways, the modern era of the civil rights movement began with President Truman. Despite his personal prejudices, he was horrified to learn of black veterans being beaten, even lynched, sometimes even by policemen, after returning to the South after World War II. And even though it risked splitting his own party, Truman began using the government to attack the legal discrimination then widespread in America, especially, although not only, in the South. Because when Truman became president, the South, in addition to being in many ways a different country from the North, was itself two very separate worlds. Jim Crow laws created innumerable legal distinctions between white and black people, and social pressures and traditions enforced and enhanced these rules, keeping whites and blacks separated and insulated from one another, except in certain approved areas such as at work, and even there the races knew their places. In every public building in the South, there were 3 or 4 bathrooms, one for white men, one for white women, and one, or hopefully 2, for colored people. White and black people drank from separate water fountains, sat in separate parts of restaurants, theaters, buses, trains, and even churches, if they were served in such places at all. In Alabama, hotels could not legally house black people, and even in states where such laws did not exist, many hotels would not cater to colored people for social and thus for business reasons. And many restaurants would only allow black people to get takeout, which they had to pick up at the kitchen door. Although others certainly allowed black people to sit in certain places. I knew a man who grew up in Mississippi during this time, and he said every middle-class white child had a black nanny. So many restaurants had a wall down the middle of the restaurant with a big window in the wall, so that the white children could sit on one side of the wall and the black nanny could sit on the other side and fuss at the kids through the window. I had a professor in college who was approximately 1 million years old, and whose mother had a black maid throughout her long life. And the two became close friends, doing everything together. But at meal times, his mother would sit at the dining room table at the end of the table closest to the kitchen. Her maid would sit at the kitchen table at the end closest to the dining room, and they would prop the door open and talk to each other over their shoulders throughout the entire meal. But they would not sit at the same table, because that's just not what you did. Throughout the South, on average, only about 20% of black adults were actually registered to vote. In some states, particularly Mississippi and Alabama, it was much lower, perhaps 5% of potential black voters actually registered. For one thing, many southern states required a literacy test for voters, but applied different standards to white and black voters, or in some cases used it to keep poor or otherwise undesirable whites from voting too. Sometimes different tests were given to white and black people. Sometimes there was just a deliberately tricky test that could be graded in subjective ways, and of course it was graded by someone who probably hated the black applicant. Some states still required a poll tax to keep the very poor, primarily black people, but sometimes whites, from voting as well. Tennessee's poll tax lasted from 1870 till 1953, and even the early 1960s, a few states such as Texas and Virginia still had one. And where Jim Crow laws were not enough, public opinion, often backed by force, completed the work of segregation and oppression. And blacks who offended against the unwritten code of Southern behavior could be beaten or even killed, usually with no repercussions for their attackers. Lynch mobs could even have the atmosphere of a carnival. In some cases, there would be picnics under the tree with the swinging black man still hanging from his robe. Some lynch mobs later sold picture postcards to commemorate participation in the event. But things were changing. Besides Harry Truman desegregating the military, a desire for the best athletes began to desegregate professional sports. In 1946, the National League Brooklyn Dodgers hired Jack Robinson, known as Jackie Robinson, away from the Negro League Kansas City Monarchs. He played for a year in the Dodgers minor league team in Montreal, and in 1947 came to Brooklyn to become the first black baseball player to play on a major league team since the 1880s. In that year, 1947, he was named Rookie of the Year. In 1949, MVP. Baseball and other professional sports began to integrate. All of this did lead in baseball to the disappearance of the Negro Leagues, which prior to this had been some of the most valuable businesses owned and operated by African Americans. The rest of the country, though, would be slow to follow the lead of baseball and other professional sports. And of course, a conservative Congress in the late 1940s refused to pass many of Harry Truman's proposed civil rights laws, but he did begin the process, in ordering the desegregation of the military and of the civil service in 1948. The Navy had already officially desegregated, with both black and white sailors on the same ships, although with black sailors often in much less prestigious and non-combat roles than white sailors. The Air Force complained a lot, but did desegregate. The Army dragged their feet the longest, officially ending segregation in 1954, partly in response to manpower shortages during the Korean War, although unofficial discrimination would continue much longer. And when Dwight Eisenhower was elected, it didn't look like much would change. Part of the issue was shifting populations brought about by the Great Migration as poor blacks left the South for the North to take advantage of good jobs in the factories. And while in some ways it was a positive change, certainly for many of the black people who took part, many white Northerners felt it was a threat to local cultures, local traditions, and after the end of World War II, a threat to the local job market as well. It also hurt the Republicans' old Northern power base, as Truman and Roosevelt's policies had brought most black voters into the Democratic Party. And as they voted Democratic in northern cities, that was changing the political complexion of the North too. And in some ways, this led to increased racial discrimination north. There were race riots attacking black workers in the North during World War II and afterwards. And the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Fergusson, still applied in almost all parts of the country. Segregation was declared to be acceptable if the separate facilities were equal. And subsequent court cases, for the most part, had confirmed that precedent, although in a few very rare instances, NAACP lawyers had been able to overturn specific cases of segregation by demonstrating that they were not equal. And it did not seem at first that Eisenhower's appointments to the Supreme Court would change this, but America was in for a surprise. Earl Warren, a former governor of California who had been very active in interning Japanese during World War II, was appointed by Eisenhower to the Supreme Court in 1953. And he would turn out to be very active in promoting social issues, to the dismay of traditionalists everywhere. And as his court made controversial decisions, undermining or overturning existing laws, many people accused him of usurping the power of Congress through judicial legislation or judicial activism. His defenders, though, said he was only making changes that needed to be made. And this debate over judicial activism continues to this day, with people typically approving of judicial activism that supports their point of view and opposing it if it does not. And in 1954, the Warren Court would have to make its first really big, difficult decision. A few years before, in 1951, the parents of Linda Brown, then a black third grader in Topeka, Kansas, complained that poor Linda had to walk more than a mile to school, even though there was a school only 7 blocks away. But it was a white school, and she had to attend the colored school. The Brown family took the issue to the local school board and was ignored. Pretty soon, the NAACP came to their aid, and the issue went to court. Finally reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, along with a number of other similar cases in 1954. The case would be argued by Thurgood Marshall, a black lawyer with the NAACP who had already successfully argued that certain cases of discrimination were, in fact, not equal, even though they were separate. And this case is remembered as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, although in fact a decision was made in several similar cases of school segregation, but it's remembered by the case that came first alphabetically in the list. The Supreme Court, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, overturned almost 60 years of legal precedent and much longer years of tradition by determining in 1954 that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. In a subsequent ruling in 1955, the court ordered the states comply with the first Brown decision with all deliberate speed. Of course, some schools deliberated a whole lot longer than others. So this did not end all school segregation immediately, and it did not require the integration of anything else yet. White and colored people would still use separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, even separate sections of restaurants and movie theaters and churches. And again, many schools in the South deliberated a long time as they moved with all deliberate speed. Although it did vary, as some states in the Upper South moved more quickly than those in the Deep South, although again with much local variation too. But for the most part, Southerners resisted integration. Many formed citizens' councils, which used legalistic means, court cases, boycotts, and public pressure to try to avoid change in the South's institutions. Furthermore, for those for whom boycotts and court cases and public pressure were not enough, a third version of the Ku Klux Klan arose in the 1950s and 1960s to oppose integration of Southern society through violence. In Birmingham, so many black churches were bombed. In the 1950s and even early 60s, some people came to call the city not Birmingham, but Bombingham. In many cases, local police openly permitted Klan violence. Later in the 1970s, the Ku Klux Klan, who are Americans too, even tried to use the court system to oppose civil rights laws, saying they infringed on the rights of business owners or others to associate freely with whom they chose. One tool used by citizens' councils was the creation of private schools, although often funded in large part by states or local school boards. But because they were officially called private schools, they were much harder for the government to regulate and thus to force to desegregate. And this also took advantage of existing private schools as well. And it was an example of the white flight beginning to take place in the 1950s and 60s as middle-class white people moved away from urban areas, or in this case, away from public schools that they feared would have too large a black population. Overall, these private schools tended to be fairly poor in quality, with the exception of some existing private schools that suddenly saw more students want to attend. And so even by the mid-1960s, fewer than 2% of black children in the Deep South were in integrated classrooms, either as schools openly resisted integration or avoided it through switching students to private schools. And it was not just the Supreme Court that forced the nation to pay attention to the mistreatment of blacks in the South. For the first time, violence in the South drew nationwide attention through the media after Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago, went to visit relatives in Mississippi in August of 1955. Although there was certainly segregation and discrimination in Chicago, it was still a different world from rural Mississippi. Till bragged to some of his friends and relations in Mississippi that he had a white girlfriend back north, something completely unacceptable and indeed illegal in the South. Then he went too far, at least according to the standards of the time and place. In a small country store, he whistled at or made a suggestive comment to the young white woman operating the store, the wife of the store owner. Exactly what he said or did is not clear. He may have whistled. He may have said, "Hey, baby." The woman claimed that he tried to lay hands upon her, although later admitted, many years later, that she had been lying. But whatever he had done or was felt to have done, or which was claimed that he had done, black people did not do to a white woman in Mississippi in 1955. 2 days later, armed men took Till from his uncle's house, beat him, shot him, and dumped him in a river with a fan from a cotton gin tied around his neck with barbed wire. Between the beating and the time his body began to bloat and decompose in the river, he was only recognizable from a ring he was still wearing that had his initials on it. At first, everybody, even locally, was shocked at the brutality of the murder, but pretty soon as national attention began to focus on Money, Mississippi, and the crime was blamed on Southern barbarity, local whites became increasingly defensive, especially when black people were allowed to testify in court against the two white men who were known to have driven off with Till before his murder, the husband and the brother-in-law of the offended white woman. And local white people, bitter at this outside attention, began to close ranks. In the Emmett Till murder trial, the defense attorney, John C. Whitten, told the jurors in his closing statement, "Your fathers will turn over in their graves if the defendants are found guilty." He said, "I'm sure every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to free these men." Despite all the evidence, the jurors deliberated for just 1 hour before returning a verdict of not guilty on September 23, 1955, after only a 4-day trial. And now safe from the threat of double jeopardy, knowing they could not be tried again for the crime, his killers freely admitted to what they had done and sold their story to national magazines for a tidy profit. And Emmett Till's funeral was filmed, and photographs appeared in magazines. And the images of his swollen, bloated, mutilated face shocked the nation, making it much harder for the North to turn a blind eye towards what was happening to black people in the South. Indeed, the national media would play a huge role in growing support for the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and especially the early 1960s. And since the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education only applied to the classroom, some black activists began to work in other ways for other changes. One of the first and most famous of these began in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, where, like most Southern bus systems, the city buses were segregated. In Montgomery, white people sat in the front of the bus, black people sat in the back, and slowly filled up towards the middle. But if the bus was full and a white person got on, the foremost black person had to give up their seat and stand so the white person could sit. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a young black activist, decided to challenge this. Riding a bus, December 1st, 1955, the bus became crowded, and when a white man got on, the driver told her to give up her seat for the white man to sit down, and she refused. She was arrested, tried, and convicted for disorderly conduct. The NAACP and local activist groups immediately took up her cause, and they elected as the leader or spokesman for their movement a young black preacher from a local Baptist church, Martin Luther King Jr. Now, sometimes you will hear that Rosa Parks was just tired and refused to stand up, as if it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. And it's true, she was tired of the system of racial discrimination, but again, it had been no accident or whim to do this. She was a trained activist employed by the NAACP who had attended the Highlander Folk School in Grundy County, Tennessee. It had been founded in 1932 during the Depression to offer adult education with kind of a socialist viewpoint. In the 1950s, their emphasis turned towards training people to fight for civil rights and for complete integration of society. This is where the famous protest song "We Shall Overcome" was written, or at least widely popularized. Martin Luther King Jr. also attended the school. But because Highlander had been founded by socialists and some of its leaders still had communist ties, it was regarded as particularly suspicious. In 1961, they were forced to close for disobeying state segregation laws, but then moved to Knoxville and later to Newmarket, Tennessee, where it still exists as the Highlander Research and Education Center. And in response to Rosa Parks' arrest, local civil rights activists planned a one-day boycott of the city buses, but after one day that didn't seem like enough. And so they decided to continue the boycott, for it would turn out 11 and a half months, as black people in Montgomery refused to ride the buses, walking or hitchhiking or carpooling. Middle-class white women who wanted their black maids there all day would sometimes drive to the black part of town and bring their maids into work. Many black people were arrested, including Martin Luther King, but the NAACP also went to court during the boycott. And a lower court, and on November 13th, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery and indeed all of Alabama's laws segregating the bus systems were illegal. And Montgomery was forced to publish new ordinances allowing black riders to sit anywhere on the bus. And in some ways this was a relief to Montgomery. While certainly many white people did ride the buses, many more black people rode them. And 11 and a half months of this boycott was significantly hurting the city financially, and of course drawing a lot of negative attention to Montgomery as well. While the bus boycott was going on in 1956, 101 Southern politicians, 99 Democrats and 2 Republicans, wrote and signed the Southern Manifesto, condemning, as they put it, the Supreme Court's clear abuse of judicial power. They further promised to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of the Supreme Court's decision, which was contrary to the Constitution, and to prevent the use of force in its implementation. Although a few prominent Southerners refused to sign it, including 3 Southern senators. Lyndon Johnson from Texas refused to sign the Southern Manifesto, although that would not hurt his career too much, as he would go on to be vice president and president just a few years later. Both of Tennessee's senators also refused to sign it. Al Gore Sr. refused to sign it, as did Estes Kefauver, a former vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, famous too for attacking the power of the mafia. Gore and Kefauver would pretty soon lose their Senate seats. Of Tennessee's 9 congressmen, 5 refused to sign it, including Carroll Reece of Johnson City. In 1955, in Tennessee, Judge Robert Love Taylor, based in Knoxville, had ordered 1 public high school to desegregate in Clinton, Tennessee, in Anderson County, a bit north of Knoxville. They had to admit black students starting in the fall of 1956. And 12 black students registered at Clinton High School, which had about 800 students, making Clinton High School in Tennessee the first public school in the South to desegregate. And while this was definitely unpopular, and there were some threats against the black students, there were no major problems at first, until an outspoken opponent of segregation from Washington, D.C., named John Kasper, came to town to organize anti-integration protests. He tried to force the principal of the school to resign, but the students and parents supported the principal. But Kasper continued to cause trouble until Judge Taylor issued a restraining order against Kasper, who was eventually charged with inciting a riot, although also eventually acquitted. Local officials asked Governor Frank Clement, known to be a big supporter of public education, for help, and he sent in 600 National Guardsmen to keep the peace. But the black students asked the school officials for more help, but the school felt if 600 National Guardsmen wasn't enough, there was nothing more they could, or at least wanted to do. And so, While the National Guard protected the students at school, some local white citizens began walking the students from their homes to the school. On December 4th, the most prominent of these citizens, the local Baptist minister, Paul Turner, was attacked and beaten nearly to death, left bleeding on the sidewalk, but the students he had been walking were protected. But this brutal attack on such a respected public figure shocked the town so much that for the rest of the year there was no more outright violence. In May of 1957, Bobby Kane became the first black student to graduate from a desegregated high school in the South. In July, Judge Taylor sentenced Kasper to a year in prison for violating a federal injunction meant to force him to obey Taylor's earlier restraining order, and things seemed to be returning to normal. Indeed, for the 1957 to 58 school year, things were reasonably peaceful, but apparently people still weren't entirely satisfied, as in October of 1958, Clinton High School was blown up with dynamite. They did on a Sunday, so nobody would be hurt, but the building was too badly damaged to be used any further. The Atomic Energy Commission lent school officials an abandoned school in Oak Ridge, and school continued. Overall, integration had succeeded, with the biggest problems instigated by outside forces. Most white people weren't happy with desegregation, but aside from one group with some dynamite, they did not want to destroy the town over it. Other places, though, would take longer and have even more trouble. In the summer of 1957, the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, made plans to desegregate its public schools. Indeed, by Southern standards, Arkansas was fairly moderate and had desegregated most of the state universities and other state facilities. Little Rock had already desegregated their buses and their libraries and even their zoo, which previously had required white and black people to go on different days. So it was felt that desegregating the schools wouldn't be too hard. 9 black students chosen for their academic excellence were enrolled in Little Rock Central High School for the fall of 1957. The plan was to kind of test desegregation in the high schools and then move on to the junior high schools and eventually elementary schools. But the day school was supposed to start, Governor Orville Faubus surprised the people of Arkansas. Faubus was pretty moderate as Southern Democrats went. Indeed, his parents had been socialists. His middle name was Eugene. But he had become more right-wing as he grew up, and most importantly, although a pretty moderate governor who had not opposed integration in the past, he had recently faced a challenge from a more conservative opponent politically, and while he'd won, he felt he needed to become more conservative on the issue of segregation. And so, when Little Rock was supposed to integrate, he called out the Arkansas National Guard to block the black students from entering the high school. A federal judge granted an injunction against his use of National Guard troops, and they were withdrawn a couple days later. But when school resumed the next Monday, September 23rd, 1957, Central High School was surrounded by Little Rock policemen. Between the school and a mob of about 1,000 white people who had gathered to protest against integration. The police escorted the 9 black students in through a side door, where they quietly entered the building as classes were to begin. But when the mob learned the students were inside, they began to challenge the police and push against them trying to get into the school with shouts and threats, hoping to lynch the Little Rock 9. And the school administration was afraid the police couldn't control the crowd and moved the black students back out of the school through a side door before noon. One of Arkansas's congressmen and the mayor of Little Rock asked the federal government for help, asking for federal marshals to enforce integration. Now, President Eisenhower had not approved of Truman's move to desegregate the military, feeling there was no need to overturn centuries of tradition. And he didn't want to get involved in the controversy over civil rights as a whole. Although his fame and prestige might have swayed people's opinion, he also didn't want to ruin his popularity by taking a controversial stand publicly. Still, the Supreme Court had made a decision, like it or not. And so when the mayor of Little Rock sent a telegram to the president asking for help, he decided he couldn't let some pipsqueak governor ignore the Supreme Court. And he federalized the Arkansas National Guard, and on September 21st, 1957, sent in the 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne Division. Although unfortunately they arrived in trucks and didn't parachute into the schoolyard, which would have been awesome. Faubus called the nationalization of the Guard an invasion. He called the 101st Airborne an occupation force. But federal troops protected the black students all year. In May of 1958, Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. The next year, Governor Faubus, with overwhelming support from the Arkansas public, just closed down all the public schools in Little Rock and then leased the buildings to private school companies. But by the spring of 1959, the public was sick of this, and the public schools were reopened and gradually integrated. Indeed, when school reopened in the fall of 1959 and protesters turned up again, Governor Faubus, now more secure politically, sent in the fire department and the police to blast the anti-integration protesters with fire hoses. In 1957, Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. Although many senators tried to block the act, most famously Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes in a filibuster to delay the vote, the longest filibuster in the history of the Senate. When he ran out of pertinent things to say, he began to read from the Bible and eventually the Washington, D.C. phone book, which remained part of Congress's permanent record. Still, supporters of the bill simply took turns sleeping in the hallways, and when he finally gave out, they all came in, and enough voted to pass the law, in part with the support of Senator Lyndon Johnson, although with the understanding that it would be a pretty mild civil rights bill. Something Eisenhower promised as well. It set up a Civil Rights Commission to investigate violations of civil rights and to use federal injunctions to secure and protect voting rights. So a first step, although not an incredibly substantial one, besides the symbolism of it being passed at all. The same year, 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy organized the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, so that they and many other black ministers and others could unite activists, mostly through black churches, to resist discrimination through nonviolent means. They also had, at least according to the FBI, ties to the Communist Party. Indeed, the FBI spied on and tried to undermine Martin Luther King Jr. many times. But he was too popular and influential for the FBI to directly attack him. Although he certainly drew criticism both from white people and eventually from younger black people who wanted faster action and felt that nonviolence might not be enough. But that criticism would mostly come in the 1960s. And the younger activists who did criticize him were fresh off another set of nonviolent protests, the sit-ins. Now, while buses in schools had officially, although in practice not always, been integrated by 1960, most restaurants had not, including the lunch counters, found in many downtown department stores and drugstores, where in the days before fast food was known outside California, a person could go in and get a quick bite to eat if they were working or shopping downtown. And these were very popular, but in most of the South, they would not serve black people at all. and that, they felt, had to change. And this would begin in Greensboro, North Carolina, where in February of 1960, a group of black students went into the lunch counter at Woolworth's, a popular chain of department stores, and sat down at the lunch counter and beginning a sit-in, sitting down and refusing to leave until they were served. Of course, they could not be served, as that violated local ordinances and company policy. But this kept the lunch counter from doing business, cutting into the store's profit. It was also photographed and filmed, including the occasional arrest, or sometimes the frequent arrests, and also the frequent harassment of the protesters, as people would come in, cuss at them and spit at them, and dump salt shakers or pepper shakers or whole sugar jars on their head, and they would sit there and take it with dignity. When they were arrested, more simply came in to fill their seats. And pretty soon this spread to other businesses in other cities and other states. The Nashville Sit-Ins in Tennessee were particularly influential, as students there helped to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to help coordinate these nonviolent protests, such as sit-ins. And under public pressure and from the loss of business, Woolworths ordered all their lunch counters nationwide desegregated in July. The fairly rapid success of this nonviolent protest over the course of 5 months brought a lot of optimism to the civil rights movement, a lot of prestige to SNCC, as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was known. But despite these victories, there was still much to do before complete equality would be obtained.